Good evening and welcome back. Pull your chair closer, whatever that looks like for you tonight. An armchair in a cold house, a phone screen in a dark bedroom, a pair of earbuds on a commute that seems to stretch longer each week. Wherever you are, we are glad you came. Drop a note if you feel like it. Tell us, where are you listening from? We mean that genuinely. We have heard from people in Cairo, in Oslo, in small towns in Ohio, where the cornfields go right up to the edge of town and the night is very dark and very wide. We love that. It matters to us that these stories reach places like that. Tonight, we are going to Egypt. Not the Egypt of tour packages, not the Egypt of gift shop papyrus and camel ride photographs, though none of that is unlovable in its way. We are going to the Egypt that existed before the world knew it existed. The Egypt of the gods. The Egypt that thought of itself as the only real country on earth. The spine of the cosmos. The axis around which everything that mattered was organized. We are going to the Egypt that built its civilization on the back of a theology so layered, so internally consistent, and so staggeringly old that every other religion in the ancient world looks, by comparison, like a rough sketch. This is going to take some time. Some things cannot be hurried. Let us begin then at the very beginning, which in Egypt was not nothing, was not void in the modern physicist's sense. In Egypt, the beginning was water, before the first god stirred, before the first thought itself into being, before anything that could be named had a name, there was none. Primordial water. Not water as you know it, not the cold water of a faucet or the warm salt water of a sea. None was the concept of water before water had a form, an infinite dark wetness pressing in on itself from all directions at once, formless and without boundary, without surface or floor. It had no light, because light had not been invented. It had no stillness, because stillness requires something to be still, in contrast to, and there was no contrast. It simply was, the way a dream is, before the dreamer knows they are dreaming. Some ancient priests, particularly those who gathered in the great city of Heliopolis, a city the Egyptians themselves called Ayunu, the city of pillars, said that within none there was already a potential, a dormant will compressed into itself like a seed that has forgotten it is a seed. Others, working out of Hermopolis, told it differently. They said the primordial condition was not one thing, but 8, 4 pairs of cosmic qualities, each quality doubled into its masculine and feminine aspect. Nun and Naunet, water and counter-water, He and Hauhet, the infinite and the counter-infinite, endlessness folded against itself, Kek and Kauket, darkness and counter-darkness, Amun and Amaunet, hidden and counter-hidden, the principle of concealment at the root of everything. These 8, the Ogdoad, did not rule the waters. They were the waters. They were not gods in the way we use the word. They were conditions. In the Heliopolitan tradition, which became, over centuries, the dominant theological frame, what happened next was this. Within none, the first god emerged. He called himself into being. He is a difficult figure to hold in the mind, because the Egyptians themselves argued about him, built competing stories around him, merged him with other gods, and then unmarred him. In his oldest forms he was Atum, which means something like the complete one, or possibly the one who comes to completion, or possibly, and this reading sits darkly at the edge of the others, the one who did not exist and then did. He rose from the waters on the first mound of earth, the Benben, a conical hill of primordial mud pushing up through none the way an island rises from a receding flood. That mound was real to the Egyptians. The pyramids, some scholars argue, are the Benben. Every obelisk is the Benben. Every temple was built to house a god on a platform of raised earth that remembered, symbolically, the first dry land. Atum stood on the Benben alone. There was no one to see him stand there, no light to illuminate his standing. He existed in darkness on a small island of earth in infinite dark water, and he was the entirety of everything that had ever existed. What he did next varied by the telling. The most ancient, most stripped-back version says simply that he created by naming. The first sound in the universe was Atum speaking his own name, and that act of self-naming was the first creative act. Sound as the origin of existence. The Logos, the priests of Memphis, would later call it, or rather, they called it Ptah's tongue. Ptah, the craftsman god, who thought the world into being and then spoke it into completion, who thought before speech, and so was the mind behind Atum's mouth. These traditions were not confused. They were operating simultaneously, the way a river has multiple currents that do not cancel each other out. In another telling, earthier, older, perhaps older than the writing that records it, Atum created alone through an act of self-generation, pleasure without partner. His hand was deified. She had a name, Iusaset, his own pleasure, becoming a divine principle, the world's first theology of creative desire. This should perhaps not surprise us. The Egyptians were not Puritans. They understood that the force which drives a man to want, to reach, to generate, was the same force that drove the universe into being. The same fire, different scale. From Atum came Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, the first complementary pair, the first couple, and already in their names a kind of grammar of creation, paired opposites that together make a livable middle space. Because in the Egyptian understanding, the livable world is always what exists between extremes, between the desert heat and the flood's excess, the valley, between darkness and annihilating light, morning, between death and immortality, the careful work of ritual and remembrance. Shu and Tefnut, wandering in the dark, got lost. Atum sent his eye, the divine eye, a separate entity, an extension of his will and sight, out into the darkness to find them. The eye went out into none and searched. While the eye was gone, Atum wept, and from his tears, when his children were at last returned to him, fell the first human beings. The Egyptians said this plainly. People came from the tears of a god's grief. Humanity was not clay, not dust, not the deliberate experiment of a benevolent craftsman. We were a byproduct of divine longing. We were the residue of a God who missed his children. I find it hard to say exactly how much that story should undo us. I am going to leave it there and move on, but I do not want to just slide past it. From Shu and Tefnut came Geb and Nut, earth and sky. And here we find one of the most visually extraordinary cosmological images in human history. In the beginning, Geb and Nut lay together, inseparable. Earth pressed against sky the way two people press together in sleep. The world between them, the space where living things might exist, did not exist yet because there was no space. Shu, their father, Air himself, reached between them and lifted Nut upward. He held her above Geb. His arms were the horizon, his body was the atmosphere. Nut arched over the world, her feet at the eastern horizon, her hands at the western, her star-spangled belly, the visible night sky overhead, and Geb lay beneath her, his body the hills and the flat plains and the river valley, his green breath the fields. Between them, the world. Nut was pregnant. She was always pregnant, swallowing the sun each evening and birthing him again at dawn. And in that great pregnancy, she carried the 5 gods who would change everything. But Ra, the sun or the aspect of Atum, and this distinction matters and also does not matter in the way that many Egyptian theological distinctions simultaneously matter and do not matter. Ra cursed Nut. She could not birth her children on any day of the year. The year, at that time, had 360 days. Every day was spoken for. There was no room. The god Thoth, Scribe, Moon, the divine accountant of heaven, gambled with the moon. He won from the moon a fragment of its light, 5 days' worth. 5 intercalary days were added to the calendar. On those 5 days, outside the year, neither past nor future, hovering in a temporal parenthesis, Nut gave birth to her 5 children: Osiris, Horus the Elder, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The year still has 365 days. The Egyptians knew why. Those 5 births mark the seam between the age of pure cosmology and the age of divine drama. What came before was architecture. What came next was story. The gods who were born in those 5 parenthetical days were not abstract principles. They were persons. They had desires and grudges and grief. They fell in love with each other. They feared death and then discovered it. They lied. They bled. Osiris was the green god of the fertile earth, of grain, of the rising flood. He was, some say, the first king, not a king of a particular country, but of the world itself. He taught people to farm. He taught people to make bread and beer. He walked the earth, and everywhere he walked, things grew. He married his sister Isis, who was desire and magic, and the deep intelligence that understands how things are held together. Set was his brother. Red, desert, storm, violence, and also courage, and also the specific strength needed to stand at the prow of the solar bark and fight the serpent Apep each night so that the sun could rise again. Set was not evil in the original theology. He was necessary. Every system needs its force of disruption. But Set wanted. What he wanted was the throne. The murder of Osiris is told in pieces across 3,000 years of texts, temple carvings, spells scratched on coffin walls, hymns sung at the edge of the flooding Nile. The fullest version we have comes late, from Plutarch, a Greek writing in Roman Egypt, which means it has been filtered through layers of foreign interpretive attention and is therefore simultaneously useful and suspect. But the shape remains. Set built a beautiful chest, a coffin made to Osiris's exact measurements, and at a feast he offered it as a gift to whoever fit inside it perfectly. Guest after guest climbed in, and it fit no one. Then Osiris lay down inside it. Set slammed the lid. He sealed it with molten lead. He threw it in the Nile. The chest floated. It traveled downstream and out to sea, and at last was beached on the shore of Byblos, in what is now Lebanon. And a great tamarisk tree grew up around it and enclosed it in its trunk. And the king of Byblos cut the tree and made it a pillar for his palace, and inside the pillar, inside the tree, inside the chest, Osiris, dead. This is the first death, the first absence of something that had been present. The Egyptians understood death as a sudden, violent narrowing of something that had been wide and full. Osiris had filled the world. He had been in the flood, and in the seed, and in the green fields, and then he was in a box, in a tree, in a palace in a foreign land. Isis searched. She is always searching. She dressed as a common woman and questioned people, which is the most ancient intelligence-gathering method in the world, and eventually she found the tree, and she recovered the chest, and she flew over the body of her dead husband with her wings spread, and what she did in that moment, the Egyptians described in terms that are erotic and sacred and grief-stricken all at once. She drew the seed of a child from the dead god, and she became pregnant with Horus, the falcon-headed son, who would have. Set found the body again. He cut it into 14 pieces, or 42, depending on the telling, the number varying, but always large, always an erasure, and scattered them across Egypt. Isis gathered the pieces. Nephthys, Set's own wife, helped her. The pieces were gathered except one, the phallus, which had been swallowed by a fish in the Nile. Isis made a replacement from gold. She and Anubis, the jackal-headed god who attended the dead, wrapped the pieces together, embalmed, bound, the first mummy, the first resurrection, and simultaneously the first funeral, because Osiris did not come back to the living world. He went to the dead one. He became the king of the afterlife, the judge of souls, the green-faced god seated on his throne in the Hall of Two Truths, with his crook and flail crossed on his chest and his eyes open in the darkness. He did not return. Isis raised their son alone. Now we must pause at the matter of ages, because the Egyptians, like so many ancient cultures, understood time not as simple progress, but as a declension, a falling away from something more complete. In the earliest age, the gods walked the earth. Ra himself ruled from the throne of Egypt as the first pharaoh, and during his reign the world was organized and luminous, and the distance between human and divine was manageable, navigable, nearly non-existent. People still remember this as a kind of template, a standard against which all later arrangements were measured and found slightly wanting. Ra grew old. This is the detail that always surprises people. The Egyptians' most powerful god grew old. His bones became silver, his flesh gold, his hair lapis lazuli. The myth says this as description, as dignity, as the gorgeous inertness of precious materials. But old is old. His mouth drooled, his eyes weakened, and humanity, sensing a power gap, began to speak against him. Some texts say they plotted, some say they mocked, some say simply that when people saw the frailty of heaven, they did what people always do. They tested the boundary. Ra punished them. He sent his eye, here manifest as Hathor, the golden goddess of love and beauty, to destroy those who had turned against him. Hathor went out and began the slaughter, and she loved it, which is perhaps the most disturbing detail in Egyptian mythology, more disturbing than the killing itself. She was intoxicated by blood. She could not stop. Ra, and this is extraordinary, changed his mind. He wanted to save at least some of the humans. So he poured 7,000 jugs of red beer across the flooded fields of Lower Egypt, and when Hathor arrived, she saw what appeared to be blood stretching to every horizon, and she drank, and she fell into a deep sleep, and she woke gentle and did not remember what she had been doing. This is why, in many temple rituals, beer was poured. This is why festivals of Hathor were called drunken festivals. The ritual remembered the day the goddess's rage was swallowed in red beer, and the human race was accidentally spared. Ra, disgusted or exhausted, or simply finished with the world, climbed onto the back of the celestial cow Nut and rose into the sky. He did not die, he just left, and from that departure came the sun's daily rising and setting. Ra, crossing the sky each day in his solar bark, descending each night into the Duat, the underworld, where he merged briefly with Osiris in the deepest hour before midnight and was renewed for another dawn. Even the gods in Egypt were required to die and be born again every single day. Even the sun had to travel through the dark. The gods retreated from direct rule. Pharaoh took their place, not as a man who ruled by permission of the gods, but as a god himself, made temporary flesh, the living Horus on the throne of the living world, who would become Osiris when he died. Pharaoh was the hinge between realms. His health was the health of the land. His moral correctness was what held the cosmos from sliding back into none. This is why Pharaoh mattered so much. This is the secret behind the pyramids, behind the temples, behind the obsessive inscription of every wall and column. All of it was maintenance work. The world required constant upkeep. Silence would become chaos. Stillness would become none. The Egyptians called the right order of things Ma'at, and we will return to her. And without Ma'at, everything unwound. Let us speak now of heroes, of the figures who moved through the divine age and the human age, in ways that broke the ordinary patterns. The first we must name is Horus, young Horus, Osiris, the child hidden in the reed marshes of the delta while his mother watched over him and his uncle Set ruled the world. We already know his birth, the son of Isis and dead Osiris, conceived in grief and magic, born to a purpose. What we have not yet traced is what it cost to be born to a purpose. Isis hid Horus in the marshes. She had to leave him, to gather the magic and knowledge she needed. And while she was gone, the child was bitten by a scorpion and nearly died. The gods themselves debated whether he could be saved. Thoth descended with the knowledge that healed him. But Horus grew up knowing that his mother had left, that the world had nearly taken him, that the throne was occupied by the thing that had killed his father. Some texts show him as a serene, falcon-headed young man. Others, and I find these more interesting, show the anxiety underneath the serenity, the falcon's fixed eyes looking out across a desert that belonged to someone else. He was trained. He was prepared. Isis was his mentor, but she was also his grief. Everything she had was invested in him. Every spell she knew was given to him. And this was love, and it was also the heaviest possible burden, to be the repository of a dead man's legacy and a grieving woman's hope simultaneously, before you have even learned to fight. When Horus was grown, he challenged Set. The Contendings of Horus and Set, this is what the Egyptians called it, the Great Contendings, lasted 80 years. This number should be understood as meaning a very long time, longer than a single human life, long enough to become legend while it was still happening. They fought physically, Horus turning himself into a young man of strength, and Set into a great hippo, Horus striking with a harpoon, the waters running red. They fought legally, appearing before the tribunal of the gods, making their cases. Horus presenting his lineage, his right, his father's precedent. Set presenting his own power, his own ancient prerogative, his argument that Egypt needed strength and he was stronger. The tribunal debated. Ra leaned toward Set. Other gods leaned toward Horus. Isis tricked Set into admitting that inheritance passes through the sun, and then the trickery was revealed, and the tribunal was furious with her and her cleverness, and excluded her from the proceedings because her cleverness was too effective and made them uncomfortable. There is something in that detail. A woman whose intelligence wins the argument and is penalized for it. I notice it, and I am not entirely sure what to do with it, and I leave it here. Set proposed a race of stone boats. Each god would sail a boat of stone. This was not a serious proposal. Stone doesn't float. But it was the kind of proposal that looks fair at first glance and is actually absurd, which Set enjoyed. Horus built a boat of wood coated in gypsum to look like stone. Set cut a mountain peak and launched it. Set's mountain boat sank immediately. Horus's wooden boat skimmed the water. Set, enraged, turned himself into a hippo and smashed Horus's boat. Horus moved to kill Set with the harpoon, and the other gods intervened. They always intervened. The contendings went on. The decisive moment, when it came, was quiet. Osiris himself sent a message from the underworld. He sent it to the tribunal of the gods. It said, approximately, "My son deserves the throne. Let me point out that I am the one who judges the dead, and all of you will be dead eventually, and you should think carefully about whose goodwill you wish to have in that hall." The gods, who were not immortal, who knew they were not immortal, voted for Horus. Set was not destroyed. He was given the storms. He was given the desert. He was placed at the prow of the solar bark to fight the chaos serpent Apep every night. He was essential. He was repositioned. This is the Egyptian solution to evil. Not extermination, but incorporation, redeployment. Set became a protective force precisely because his violence was too great to eliminate. Horus took the throne and became the first pharaoh of the restored world. Every pharaoh after him, Nama, Sneferu, Khufu, Hatshepsut, Ramesses, all of them down through 3,000 years, was Horus. They wore the double crown, Horus's crown, the white of Upper Egypt nested in the red of Lower Egypt. When they died, they became Osiris. This was not metaphor. This was administrative reality. Now we must speak of Isis herself, not only as Horus's mother, but as a figure in her own right. She was born on the second of the 5 intercalary days, and from her birth, something was known about her that was not known about the others. She was the one who understood how things were held together. Osiris brought fertility and kingship. Set brought power and storm. Horus brought justice and the falcon's clarity. Isis brought the knowledge of relationships, not emotional relationships specifically, though those too, but structural ones. She knew what each thing needed to remain what it was. She knew the secret name of Ra. That last detail is important. In the Egyptian understanding of magic, to know the secret name of something was to have power over it. Everything had a true name beneath its ordinary name. The true name of Ra was hidden, the most powerful secret in the universe, and Ra guarded it. Isis contrived to learn it. She gathered Ra's spit from the earth. The sun leaves traces of itself as it passes, and she mixed it with dirt, and she made a serpent, and she sent the serpent to bite Ra, and when Ra was in agony from the venom, she offered to heal him if he would tell her his true name, and in his agony he told her, and she healed him, and she carried the secret from then on. She used it to resurrect Osiris. She used it to heal Horus in the marshes. She used it to make magic that would not otherwise be possible. The priests of Isis were, consequently, extremely powerful. Her cult spread beyond Egypt eventually, out across the Mediterranean world, into Rome, into the provinces of the Roman Empire, as far as Britain, where a temple to Isis stood by the Thames in what would become London. She outlasted all the other gods in active worship. She was still being honored in her temple at Philae in 535 CE. After Rome had become Christian, after Egypt had become Christian, a small pocket of the old religion, burning quietly in the south like an ember. The thing about Isis is that she was described, always, as the one who finds what is lost. She found Osiris in the tamarisk tree. She found his scattered pieces. She found the way to make the dead generate life. She is the patron of searches, of grief that refuses to stop, of love that is so stubborn it bends the laws of nature. And she is the patron of magic, of Heka, the Egyptians' word for the force that underlies all other forces, the energy that makes spells work and makes the world cohere. Heka was not supernatural to the Egyptians. It was structural. It was in the fabric of things. Which brings us to a figure who is not a hero in the martial sense, but is perhaps the most important figure in Egyptian theology after Osiris and Ra, Thoth. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, or sometimes a baboon, or sometimes a man with the head of an ibis and a scroll under his arm and a look on his painted face that might be described as the look of someone who has been keeping accurate records for a very, very long time and finds the inaccuracies of others both exhausting and unsurprising. He was the god of writing, of mathematics, of time, of magic, of the moon. He invented the calendar. He invented hieroglyphs, or, more precisely, he was believed to have invented writing, which in Egypt meant hieroglyphs, which meant that every scribe in Egypt was serving a god whose specific domain was the inscription of truth. Every text was sacred. Every word correctly carved was an act of reverence for Thoth. He was the mediator. When the gods fell into conflict, and they did, constantly, in ways that threatened to unravel the world, Thoth was the one called in. He stood between Ra and the forces of chaos. He stood between Horus and Set when the Contendings threatened to become simply an endless violence without resolution. He adjudicated, he recorded, he held the ledger. In the Hall of Two Truths, where the dead were judged, it was Thoth who stood ready with his pen and his scroll. It was Thoth who recorded the result of the weighing of the heart, the scales with the feather of Mut on one side and the dead person's heart on the other. And if the heart was heavier than the feather, the beast Amit devoured it, and there was no afterlife, no second chance. And it was Thoth who wrote it down in the Book of the Dead, the book that knows, the record that does not lie. I need to pause here and collect the thread. We have covered creation, the first death, the birth of the divine family, the Contendings, the first heroes. We are about to turn to Ramses, to the great empire age, to the pharaohs who built the things we still look at. Let me say simply that the theology was already 3,000 years old before Ramses was born, and the pharaohs of the great empire were not innovating. They were, in their own minds, maintaining, preserving what had always been. The pyramids were not progress. They were insurance. They were proof that things stayed where they were put. The fourth figure we must trace is Hatshepsut, because to speak of Egypt's heroes without her is to leave a gap that distorts everything that surrounds it. She was born in the early part of the 18th dynasty, which is what historians call the beginning of the New Kingdom, the period when Egypt was richest and most powerful and most sure of itself. Her father was Thutmose I, a capable military pharaoh who had extended Egypt's reach into Nubia and the Levant, and who understood, in the practical way that good administrators understand things, that power requires management. He is depicted with her in ways that suggest she participated in governance alongside him from early on, the way a crown prince might. She married her half-brother Thutmose II, which was standard. The Egyptians did not flinch from this. Divinity required a certain consolidation. Thutmose II was not robust. His mummy, when it was eventually unwrapped in the 19th century, showed a man who had been ill in several ways, whose skin bore the marks of a disease that had eaten away at him, who had not been comfortable in his body. He ruled about 15 years. He died, and their son Thutmose III, born of a secondary wife, a woman named Iset, was the heir. But Thutmose III was a child. Hatshepsut became regent. She was not the first woman to rule Egypt. She was not even the first woman to take full pharaonic titles. But she is the most fully documented, the most architecturally present, the most undeniably there. She ruled for approximately 22 years. She wore the double crown. She wore the false beard. She was depicted as male in the canonical images, straight-shouldered, kilted, with the cartouche of a king, while other images, seemingly from the same workshops, the same reign, depicted her as female in the graceful wig and sheath dress of a queen, both at once. The Egyptians did not appear to be confused by this. The office was male. The person was female. Both were true. Her mentor was a man named Senenmut, whose role in her life has been the subject of speculation for as long as Egyptology has been a discipline. He was not of royal blood. He had risen through the scribal classes, through administrative work, through an evident brilliance that Hatshepsut recognized and rewarded. She gave him the care of her daughter Neferu, whom she had with Thutmose II. She gave him her buildings. He is credited as the architect of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which is still standing, which is still visited, which is still capable of stopping people mid-step and making them stare. 3 tiers of colonnaded terraces cut into the cliffs of the West Bank at Luxor. The whole thing, a piece of theater that understands exactly what the desert and the rock and the angle of morning light will do to the human eye. Whether she loved him is unanswerable. There are graffiti scratched near the temple, coarse images, unmistakably suggesting a physical relationship between a great lady and a man who attended her. But graffiti is graffiti. People scratch things. The image might be slander. It might be testimony. It might be the kind of thing lonely workers scratched on walls because they were bored and because the people in charge were very far away. And what were they going to do about it? What we know. She sent an expedition to Punt. This is the detail that delighted her. Apparently, the records of the Punt expedition are among the most enthusiastically documented events of her reign. The walls of Deir el-Bahri covered with images of the cargo, myrrh trees in baskets with their roots still wrapped in earth, live trees transported back to Egypt to be planted in the god's garden, live animals, incense, gold, ebony, ivory. Punt was a land of abundance in Egyptian mythology and political geography. Somewhere to the southeast, probably on the Horn of Africa, possibly coastal Somalia or Ethiopia, though the location has never been definitively established. What matters is that Egypt had not sent a trading fleet there in a very long time, and Hatshepsut sent one, and it came back loaded. She built enormously, 2 obelisks at Karnak, so tall they rose above the pylon walls, sheathed in electrum, so that when the morning sun hit them, they became light itself, became Ra himself, standing vertical in the Nile Valley. She built chapels and shrines, and added halls to existing temples. She built, with Senenmut, the beautiful white terraces at Deir el-Bahri that fit themselves into the cliff as though they had always been there, as though the mountain had been waiting for them. Then she died, or, because nothing about Hatshepsut is simple, she became Osiris. At some point between the 20th and 22nd year of her reign, she is gone from the records. Thutmose III, now grown, took the throne. Some years later, not immediately, perhaps as much as 20 years later, statues of Hatshepsut were smashed, obelisks were walled over, inscriptions were chiseled away. For a long time, historians assumed this was done in fury, a man destroying the woman who had held him from his birthright. More recent scholarship is more careful. The erasures were strategic, specific. Many of her images were left alone. What was removed was the image of a female pharaoh, because Thutmose III needed his succession to be clean, needed the line of kings to be unambiguous, needed history to read without interruption. She was not erased from hatred, she was edited for tidiness. It did not work. She came back. She always comes back. When Egyptologists began finding her cartouches beneath later plaster in the 19th century, when they understood what they were looking at, when the mummy in KV60 was identified through DNA as female and then through a loose tooth in a canopic chest as specifically Hatshepsut, when that happened, she came back with compound interest. The world had missed her for 3,000 years without knowing it was missing her. The great Ramses II, the magnificent, the one whose statues keep turning up, buried in cornfields and under Cairo apartment buildings, deserves his section, though the truth is that I find myself somewhat less excited by Ramesses than by Hatshepsut, and I am going to honor that honestly, rather than pretend even-handedness I do not feel. Ramesses was extraordinary. He ruled for 66 years. He built Ramesseum. He built Abu Simbel, where the great colossi of himself sit in the Nubian desert still. 4 statues, each 20 meters tall, carved from the cliff face, their scale being the message. He fought the Hittites at Kadesh, and it was either a draw or a slight Hittite victory. The historical evidence leans toward the latter, and Ramesses declared it a magnificent Egyptian triumph and inscribed that triumph on every temple he could find. He was, in this way, one of the first great propagandists in recorded history. He understood that the story told about a battle matters as much as the battle. He signed the first known peace treaty in recorded history, the Treaty of Kadesh, with the Hittite king Hattusili III. Both sides kept copies. Copies have survived. In its terms, one can read the anxious diplomacy of 2 great empires acknowledging, in formal language that neither could destroy the other, and that continuing to try was expensive. This is wisdom of a kind, expensive wisdom, bought in blood. But Ramesses is, I am going to say it, a figure more remarkable for his longevity and his public relations than for the depth of his religious or philosophical contribution. He was the empire doing what empires do, expanding, building, inscribing, eating. Hatshepsut was something stranger and more interesting, a woman finding a way to be within a system not designed for her, fully herself. Anyway, let us turn to the great collective event, the one toward which all the individual stories had been bending. Call it the Amarna Revolution, though revolution is perhaps too modern a word for it. Call it the heresy of Akhenaten. Call it the moment the Egyptian theological system reached its internal crisis point and broke, briefly, catastrophically, and then healed over as though it had never happened. Amenhotep IV became pharaoh sometime around 1353 BCE, son of the magnificent Amenhotep III, inheritor of an empire at the peak of its wealth and complexity. He changed his name to Akhenaten, servant of Atum, beneficial to Atum, and what he did next had no precedent in 3,000 years of continuous civilization. He abolished the gods, not privately, not metaphorically. He had the names of the gods chiseled from inscriptions across Egypt. He closed the temples. He dismissed the priesthood. And this requires a moment's attention, because the priesthood of Amun at Karnak had become, over centuries, essentially a second government, wealthy beyond easy comprehension, controlling vast agricultural estates, politically influential, economically powerful. Akhenaten's attack on the gods was also an attack on the institutional power of those who served the gods, which gives his religious revolution a motive that historians have debated without resolution for over a century. He built a new city. He built it on a virgin stretch of desert on the east bank of the Nile, equidistant between Memphis and Thebes, a place that had never been claimed by any previous god. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of Atum. We call it Amarna. He moved the court there. He moved the administration there. He and his queen Nefertiti and their daughters performed the rites of the one god, the solar disk, the Atum, whose name was written differently from all other divine names, written as a cartouche, like a pharaoh's name, because the Atum was a king god, not a person, but a principle, the light itself as divine presence, generative and singular. Nefertiti, she is another Hatshepsut, in the sense of being a woman whose power was real and documented and then partially obscured, though in her case, the obscuring began during her own lifetime. She may have ruled as pharaoh after Akhenaten's death under the name Neferuaten. The evidence is incomplete. The evidence is always incomplete where powerful women are concerned in this history, and I think the incompleteness is itself a kind of testimony. The Amarna art was unlike any Egyptian art before or after. The proportions were strange. elongated skulls, narrow shoulders, wide hips, full lips, bodies shown in informal intimacy that no pharaoh had ever been shown in before. Akhenaten and Nefertiti sitting together, their children on their laps. Ordinary human warmth inscribed in the revolutionary medium of official state art. Scholars argue about what this means. Was Akhenaten deformed by a genetic condition that the art faithfully records? Was the art a deliberate theological statement about the divine body as different from the human body? Was it simply a new aesthetic pursued for its own beautiful strangeness? The city lasted perhaps 17 years. Akhenaten died. His son, or perhaps stepson, or son-in-law, the exact relationship is contested, took the throne as Tutankhaten and then changed his name to Tutankhamun. Amun, back in the name, back in everything. The priests were restored, the temples reopened. The old gods came flooding back with what must have felt, for those who still believed in them, like rain after years of drought. The court moved back to Thebes. Amarna was abandoned. Within a generation, it was being systematically demolished, its stones reused as fill for other buildings. The name of Akhenaten was removed from the king lists. He was referred to, in the documents that mentioned him at all, as the criminal of Akhenaten, or simply the enemy. His face was chiseled from monuments. His city was unmade. This too is a kind of erasure. But unlike Hatshepsut's edited absence, Akhenaten's erasure was motivated by something that felt closer to genuine horror. He had not simply threatened a succession, he had threatened the structure of the universe. In Egyptian understanding, the gods were not optional, they were the architecture of existence. To remove them was to threaten the dissolution of Ma'at, the unraveling of the order that kept Nun at bay. The priests who restored the old religion were not being conservative. They were, in their own understanding, preventing the end of the world. Some scholars have found resonances between Atenism and monotheism, between Akhenaten's solar theology and whatever happened in Sinai in the centuries around this period. The connections are unprovable and hotly contested, and there are careers dedicated to arguing both sides. I will leave the argument where it belongs and simply note the desire to find a single divine principle behind the proliferation of divine forms is not unique to Egypt and not unique to any period. It recurs. It will always recur. Something in human thinking reaches toward the unity behind the apparent multiplicity, and that reach is very old. Tutankhamun died young. He was perhaps 19. His tomb was small for a pharaoh, and hurriedly finished and sealed, and then covered by the debris of a later tomb. And for 3,000 years nobody found it, and in 1922, Howard Carter found it, and what was inside the small, crowded, hastily finished tomb of a teenage pharaoh who had not been meant to die young was so much gilded beauty, so much careful preparation for the afterlife, such an excess of care packed into inadequate space that it stopped the modern world in its tracks and has never quite released it. The gold mask, the nested coffins, the alabaster jars, the gilded shrine, the Shabti figures, the gilded bed in the shape of a lion, the small objects, the personal things, a lock of hair from his grandmother T, a pair of sandals, a wooden headrest, all of it for a boy who wanted more time and did not get it, interred by people who understood that what you send into the darkness with the dead is love in material form. After the Ramesside period, after the great empire builders, the temple raisers, the inscription carvers, Egypt began its long slide into what historians call the Third Intermediate Period, which is a name that conveys exactly nothing about the strangeness and fragmentation that followed. The unified state broke into pieces. Libya became dominant in the north. Nubia, Kush, rose in the south. And there is exquisite irony in the fact that the Nubian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were, in many ways, the most orthodox pharaohs Egypt had seen in centuries. Strict adherence to the old forms, the old temple customs, the old theological propriety. The people Egypt had conquered and ruled and depicted as enemies on countless temple walls became, for a time, the most faithful keepers of the Egyptian tradition. Then Assyria came, then Persia, then Alexander. Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, and the Egyptians welcomed him, which surprises people when they first encounter it, but should not. He was not the first foreign conqueror. He was coming after the Persians, who had been deeply unpopular, who had, by some accounts, killed the sacred Apis bull, which was the kind of religious offense that the Egyptians could not forgive and would not. Alexander came and sacrificed to the gods and acknowledged the gods and was declared the son of Amun, went to the oracle at the oasis of Siwa to have this confirmed, and was confirmed, and thus became theologically legitimate. He wore the double crown in the reliefs. He became Pharaoh in the only way that mattered. He then left. He was always leaving. The whole Mediterranean world was a set of places Alexander passed through and changed and then departed, leaving someone else to deal with the consequences. He left his general Ptolemy. Ptolemy founded a dynasty. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 3 centuries and did the same thing Alexander had done, adopted the local theology, built temples in Egyptian style, called themselves pharaohs, wore the double crown. They also imported Greek bureaucracy, Greek settlers, Greek culture, and Alexandria became one of the great intellectual cities of the ancient world, a place where the Greek geometers and the Egyptian astronomers and the Jewish theologians were all in the same city, reading from the same enormous library. Cleopatra VII. The Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies. She is not a subject for quick treatment. She is not a subject for treatment as seductress or tragic beauty or any of the roles that Roman propaganda assigned her and that subsequent history compulsively rehearsed. She was a woman of formidable education. The ancient sources say she spoke 9 languages, that she was the first Ptolemy to bother learning Egyptian, and formidable political intelligence who watched her kingdom disappear under forces she had identified clearly and fought against shrewdly and ultimately could not stop. The arrival of Rome in the Mediterranean was not a political event that individual brilliance could have reversed. She understood this. She fought anyway. When she died, in 30 BCE, the 3,000-year story ended in a formal sense. Egypt became a Roman province. The temples continued to operate. Priests continued to conduct the old rituals. But the pharaoh was no longer present. Or rather, the pharaoh was now in Rome, and the Roman emperors did have themselves depicted as pharaohs on temple walls. Trajan appears in full pharaonic regalia at Dendera, offering to the gods. But something had shifted. The frame that held the meaning had moved. Egypt was no longer the axis of the world. It was a grain province. It was revenue. This is a grief that I am not going to aestheticize. Let me speak now of Maat, because everything in Egypt points toward Maat, the way water points toward a drain, and we have been circling her long enough. Maat is often translated as truth, justice, or order. The most common scholarly formulation is something like the correct order of things, divinely ordained. None of these translations quite catches what the Egyptians meant, because what the Egyptians meant was not a legal principle or a philosophical concept, but a physical property of existence, the way gravity is a physical property of existence. Maat was the balance that kept the universe from collapsing. She was also a goddess, small, female, seated, with an ostrich feather in her hair, the feather that was placed on the scales in the Hall of Two Truths. She was both the principle and its embodiment, both the rule and the person who was the rule. When Pharaoh performed ritual, when he burned incense and offered food and poured libations and recited hymns, he was not performing symbolic acts. He was doing maintenance work on the structure of reality. Maat needed to be continually affirmed. The chaos at the edges, the desert, the Nile's unpredictability, the foreign armies pressing at the borders, the darkness that came every night and had to be fought through before dawn. All of it was the pressure of Isfet, the Egyptian word for what was wrong, what was disordered, what was not Maat. The ritual pushed back. The inscription of the god's name on the temple wall pushed back. The building of the pyramid pushed back, because the pyramid was the Ben made permanent, the first hill of creation standing in stone and saying, "We are here, we have made a mound in the flood, we refuse to dissolve back into none." The concept of Maat connects directly to the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife, which was not, and this is important, not simply a matter of being good. In the modern Western understanding, rooted in later religious traditions, the afterlife is primarily a moral judgment. Did you do good or evil? But the Egyptian system, while it did include moral dimensions, was more complicated and more strange. What was weighed on the scales was not a simple ledger of sins and virtues. It was something called the heart, Ib, the center of the self, the seat of intention and memory and feeling. And what it was weighed against was the feather of Maat. What the scales measured was whether you had lived in accordance with the structure of the real, whether your weight, your density, your accumulated choices had made you heavier than truth or light as truth. People who had suffered unjustly, who had been wronged, who had carried heavy griefs. These people were not necessarily penalized. The scales were not a mechanism for confirming the existing social order. The heart of a slave who had lived with wisdom and honesty might be lighter than the heart of a pharaoh who had lied. The Egyptians do not appear to have found this troubling. They built it into the system. They put it in their Book of the Dead, their coffin texts, their pyramid texts, their tomb walls. They insisted on it. There is a text called the Declaration of Innocence, sometimes called the Negative Confession, in which the dead soul stands before 42 judges, one for each of Egypt's administrative districts, and declares what they have not done. I have not caused pain. I have not caused tears. I have not killed. I have not told lies. I have not stolen. I have not had sex with a child. The list is very long. It is also not an assertion of perfection. The scholars are clear that the Egyptians understood these declarations as what the deceased aspired to have been, not what they necessarily were. It was an orientation, a direction of travel, standing before the 42 judges and saying, "This is the kind of person I was trying to be." This, too, the Egyptians built into stone and put underground in the dark. The dead who passed the weighing of the heart went to the field of reeds, the Aru, which the Egyptians depicted as Egypt, the same fertile fields, the same canals, the same clear light, the same work of planting and harvesting. This is sometimes described as unimaginative. Oh, the Egyptians just imagined the afterlife as more Egypt. But I think this misses something. The Egyptians loved Egypt. They genuinely believed that the Nile Valley was the most beautiful and most ordered place in the world. Their afterlife was not a projection of inadequacy into a fantasized elsewhere. Their afterlife was the best thing they could imagine. It was Egypt, but without Isfet. Egypt, but with Mut holding. The dead were not passive in the field of reeds. They worked. They continued. They existed in what might be called the full version of the life they had been practicing in the living world. The Shabti figures found in tombs, thousands of them in some burials, one for each day of the year, were magical substitutes. If the dead were called upon to do agricultural labor in the field of reeds, and they might be, even the afterlife had work to be done, the Shabti would do it for them. The Egyptians prepared carefully. They were meticulous people. They sent copies of everything into the dark. The question of whether the soul was singular or plural was something the Egyptians addressed head-on and answered complexly. The Ka was the vital force, the double, the aspect of the self that needed food and drink, and that the offerings left in the tomb sustained. The Ba was what we might call the personality, the individual character, the bird-headed human figure that flew between the living world and the dead, that could not be destroyed, but could be made homeless if the body was lost, which is why mummification mattered so much. The Ak was the transformed soul, the one that had successfully navigated death and become a being of light. The Ren was the name, and to speak the name of the dead was to make them present, to give them continued existence, which is why the names carved in tombs were so carefully maintained, why the erasure of a name was the worst kind of death you could inflict on someone. The pharaohs who had their names erased, Akhenaten, Hatshepsut, others, suffered, in the Egyptian understanding, a true and complete second death, or they would have, if the names had stayed erased. They did not. The chisel could not go everywhere. Some names survived in obscure places, under later paint, in archive copies, and then eventually the archaeologists came. Here is the thing about names. They outlast everything else. The chisel outlasts the wielder. The stone outlasts the chisel. But the name on the stone outlasts the stone. Because the name exists in the act of reading, and reading can be done by anyone, anywhere, even someone who learned what hieroglyphs were from a grammar book bought in a second-hand shop in a country that did not exist when the name was first inscribed. Something close to a modern unease surfaces here, the feeling that every act of reading is a kind of resurrection, that we are implicated by looking, that we are the audience the Egyptians were writing for all along. And then the feeling retreats, because the Egyptians did not know about us, or at least did not know the specifics of us, and it would be self-flattering to imagine they were writing for our benefit. They were writing for the gods. They were writing for the dead. We are the unexpected inheritance. We came into existence in their future and read their words across the longest gap. In the 2nd century CE, the Egyptian temple system was still functioning. Priests still performed the daily rituals, washing the god's image, clothing it, offering food and incense, singing the morning hymns. The outside world had changed utterly. Rome ruled. Greek was the language of administration. The entire Mediterranean had become one interconnected system of trade and politics. But inside the sanctuaries of the temples, priests who had memorized texts older than the Trojan War walked the same paths their predecessors had walked for 100 generations. The scholar Jan Assmann has argued that Egypt invented the concept of translatability, the idea that the gods of one culture could be recognized as aspects of the gods of another, that Amun and Zeus were the same principle under different names. This is not the same as syncretism, though it leads toward it. It is more like the deep confidence of a theological system so ancient and so internally consistent that it can afford to absorb foreign comparisons. The Egyptian system was old enough to be calm about other systems. It had been around long enough to recognize patterns. This is, perhaps, a kind of wisdom that only very long continuity produces, a wisdom that requires time measured not in decades or centuries but in millennia. There is no shortcut to 3,000 years of accumulated theological refinement. It takes what it takes. The temples fell silent slowly, not all at once. The last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at Philae. The last known demotic text is from 452 CE, also at Philae. The temple of Isis at Philae continued to receive worshippers until 537 CE, when the Byzantine Emperor Justinian closed it. The priests walked out. The rituals stopped. The gods did not depart dramatically. They simply were no longer addressed. The conversation ended. Or did it end? The question is less simple than it seems. Isis moved into the figure of the Virgin Mary. not through formal transmission, but through visual and emotional resonance. The seated woman nursing an infant, the mother and divine child, the grief of the mother at the death of the son. Osiris moved into the dying and rising god who judges the dead. These are parallels, not identities. Scholars are careful to say, influence is hard to prove, resonance is not transmission. But the resonances are there, pressing against the careful, scholarly disclaimers, like water against a wall. Thoth became Hermes Trismegistus in the Hermetic tradition, 3 times great Hermes, the master of hidden knowledge, the divine scribe who knows the secret name of things. The Hermetic texts, compiled in Alexandria in the 1st centuries CE, are half Greek philosophy and half Egyptian theology, and entirely confident that these are the same thing. They were enormously influential on medieval European thought, on alchemy, on the Renaissance, on the Western esoteric tradition that runs underground through centuries of history and surfaces periodically in unexpected places. The obelisks were moved. Rome took them first. There are more obelisks in Rome than in Egypt, a fact that requires a moment to absorb. Then the modern nations came for them. There is one in Paris, in the Place de la Concorde, where the guillotine was used during the Revolution. There are 2 in New York and London, called Cleopatra's Needle, though they have nothing to do with Cleopatra, carved during the reign of Thutmose III, sheathed for transport against the Victorian Ocean, installed in cities that did not exist when they were made. They stand in the cold northern air, and their hieroglyphs say the same things they said when they were carved. The name of Thutmose, the name of Ra, the praise of Ma'at, the list of the king's deeds. The pyramids need nothing from us. They stand. They have stood through the entire duration of recorded human history, and will probably outlast the next several thousand years of it, barring catastrophes we cannot currently predict. They are their own argument. They are the Ben, the primordial hill, the refusal to dissolve. Every stone placed with such precision, the astronomical alignments so exact that we still argue about the instruments used to achieve them, the interior chambers designed with a mathematical intentionality that we have decoded only partially. All of it was the Egyptians saying, in stone, the same thing they said in ritual and in text and in mummification. We are here. We persist. We refuse the dissolution. We maintain the mound against the flood. Anyway, what does it mean to inherit this? To be born into a world where the pyramids are 3 times older than the Parthenon, 4 times older than the Colosseum, and still standing. It means that the oldest human attempt at permanence is also the most successful. It means that whatever the Egyptians were doing when they built, they were doing it right. Not right in every particular, the slaves, the coercion, the resource extraction, the absolute power of divine kingship, but right in the sense that the intention held. The intention was to persist, and they did. The story told tonight, told to you, in your dark bedroom, your lit commute, your cold house, is not finished. It was never finished. The Egyptian theological system produced a set of questions that no subsequent civilization has answered better, and in many cases has not answered as well. questions about what is owed to the dead, about what the soul is made of, and how many parts it has, and what happens to each part, about whether the universe has a structure that moral behavior either maintains or violates, about whether the gods can be trusted with grief, about whether the balance can hold. A tutored eye, and this is a benzetme that almost works, the idea of the eye that has been trained to see, looks at the modern world and finds Egypt in unexpected places, in the scales held by the blindfolded woman outside courthouses, in the understanding that to speak a person's name is to honor their continued existence, in the conviction that the dead deserve ritual, deserve care, deserve to be remembered as specific people with specific hearts whose weight mattered. The feather of Mahat is still being used. We just forgot where we got it. There is a word in Arabic for the people who live in Egypt now, Misriyin, Egyptians. The word for Egypt is Misr. This is not the Greek name, Aegyptos, which gave us the English. This is the old Semitic name, the one that appears in ancient Near Eastern texts, in the Hebrew Bible, in the records of trading partners who knew Egypt from outside and named it something that might derive from the Arabic root for civilization or metropolis, or simply the place. The people who live along the Nile today are not the same people who built the pyramids. No people is the same people 3,000 years later, genetically or culturally or linguistically, but they are not entirely different either. The Fellahin, the farmers of the Nile Valley, have been farming the same alluvial soil for a very long time. The water comes from the same mountains. The crops are different, but the patience required to grow them is not. Something continues, in the way that rivers continue, not the same water, but the same valley, the same direction, the same banks. The last scribes of the ancient tradition understood that they were last. There is a text from Philae, written in the period when the old knowledge was clearly ending, in which a priest describes the sacred books and the sacred rituals with the specific urgency of someone who knows they are writing for an archive rather than a living community. He is not performing the ritual. He is recording it. He is choosing words carefully because he knows these words are the last generation of words that will have been spoken aloud by someone who learned them from someone who learned them from someone who learned them from someone who had not yet died, across the whole long chain back. This act, writing for a future that has not arrived yet, trusting that the words will be found, that someone will learn to read them, is one of the most human acts there is. It is what the Egyptians did on every tomb wall. It is what the priests at Philae did in the last days. It is, in a small way, what we are doing now, collecting the thread of a very old story and handing it forward. The names persist. The questions persist. Osiris is still in the box in the tamarisk tree, and Isis is still searching, and Set is still in the storm, and Thoth is still waiting at the edge of the scales with his pen ready, and the Nile is still flooding, and the desert is still waiting at the edge of the fields, and the sun still goes down each evening and has to fight its way back. Consider, for a moment, that the Egyptian solar bark, Ra in his boat, passing through the 12 hours of the night, through the 12 caverns of the Duat, past the serpent Apep, who must be cut and subdued and bound each night, emerging at last at the eastern horizon renewed. Consider that this image is approximately 5,000 years old and describes, with more emotional accuracy than almost any modern framework, what it feels like to get through a bad night. You pass through the dark. The serpent is real. You fight it or you do not, and in the morning you find out which. The boat carries you. In that sense, Akhenaten's revolution was not entirely wrong. There is something about the sun, about light returning, about the daily fact of mourning as a kind of proof. The Egyptians built an entire theology of it, and it is very old and very carefully made, and it still, in the places where it touches the actual experience of being alive in a body, on a planet, fits. The sentences are getting shorter now because the story is getting heavier. This is how it works. The weight accumulates. The words start to fall away. What is left is not nothing. What is left is the thing that was always there underneath. The river, the field, the morning, the name on the stone, the eye open in the dark, the feather, the scale, the heart. The field of reeds waiting on the other side, where the work continues. Good night. Wherever you are listening from, we hope the light comes back for you in the morning. We'll be here again when you're ready. Take care of yourselves, and we will talk soon.